Thank you for joining us today for our final lecture of the semester. It's been quite a semester, so let's get to it and get to our most modern topic, the 2000s. 2000 itself was an interesting year. We saw the threats of Y2K that never materialized. We saw the cultural changes in the 1990s. And those changes would really continue into the new millennium. It began with a very controversial election of 2000. We had two main candidates. We had a third party candidate that would, similar to the 1992 election, kind of play spoiler with the overall results. So on the Republican side, there was George W. Bush, the son of the prior George Bush, who was president. On the Democratic side, we had Al Gore, vice president to Bill Clinton, whose 2 terms were up. So Al Gore is running for promotion. And then the third party candidate we had was Ralph Nader. The election was very, very, very close. Normally we see states, we know that you win state by state, right? But this is showing county by county election results. And we can see, and this kind of continues today, where Democrats tend to be more popular in big cities. Even though you see more red on this map, the blue represent usually cities that are higher in population, so therefore carry a little more weight, whether it's in the state vote or in the national vote. So this election was one of those elections where we didn't know who won until much, much later. And the election would come down to Florida. So as you can see, this is the Florida result. And we see just how tight it is. You can do the math. You see about 6,000 votes had Bush ahead of Gore, with 99% of the precincts reporting. This was on election night. News networks had first called the election for Gore, or for Bush. Then they were saying, no, maybe not, maybe it's Gore, and they kind of retracted who they called. And so Florida would be where everything comes down to. And with such a tight election, there was a recount. And Florida had a unique way of voting. We're used today to really touch machines, where there's hopefully less room for error. But Florida used these punch cards. And what happened was you got your card, and you got a little tool that was supposed to punch out for the candidate that you wanted. So take a look at the take a look at the image on the right. Now, hopefully, you punched all the way through, and there was just a hole left in your ballot. But when they got to the recount, they had to interpret the results of people who had voted, and they started thinking, well, check out number 1, a hanging door Chad, or number 2, a swinging door Chad. They called those hanging Chads. And as they were recounting, they had to decide, are those votes that people intended for that candidate for president? And in the recount, they said yes, that the hanging Chads did count, but then there became questions over, what about these other types of Chads? What about that tri-Chad, for example, where 3 of the corners are still connected? What if somebody dimpled the Chad? Does that mean they meant to vote for that person, or did they maybe change their mind and decide not to vote at all in the presidential race? And then they had one that they also called a pregnant Chad, which just barely had any kind of mark on it. Those latter 2 were not counted, but this really shows how tight the election was. This went on for a month after the election. Remember, Inauguration Day is in January, so we were already less than a month out from Inauguration Day. Eventually, the Supreme Court got involved, and on December 12th, the Supreme Court halted the recount where it stood at that moment in Florida. This would be the closest American election since 1876, so in 125 years. And the result came down to Florida, again, like we said. George Bush, when the recount stopped, won Florida by 537 votes. Florida was the tie-breaking state. It gave Bush the presidency. If you look in at the map Up top, we see in the Electoral College just how close it was. It doesn't get any closer than that. And in the popular vote, check that out too. It's unique in that this has only happened a few times. It's happened, I believe, 5 times in American history, where the candidate who got the most votes across the country did not become president, just because of how the Electoral College is set up. Those small states like North and South Dakota get 3 electoral votes. It's nominally based on population, but for the smallest populated states, they get an outsized vote. So Bush was able to win and became president. He had some big economic goals. The first thing he did was he proposed quite a few tax cuts in 2001. There was also a recession in 2001. So how a president handles economic issues, right, tells us maybe how successful or how unsuccessful they'll be. The thing that overshadows pretty much all of what Bush wanted to do became the September 11th attacks. So these are just 8 months into his presidency. We know that Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial planes. 2 of them were crashed into the Twin Towers in New York, into the World Trade Center. And those buildings collapsed, killing almost 3,000 people. This was among the darkest days in American history. If you ever want to just have kind of your own oral history interview, find someone who was alive at the time and ask them their memories of the day. It's one of those events where everybody knows exactly where they were when it happened. A 3rd jet was crashed into the Pentagon, which suffered damage. And a 4th jet was believed to be headed to the Capitol to crash into that as well. That's the one where the passengers fought back and kind of retook, or there was a fight in the cockpit, and the plane crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So the question right immediately was, once people got over the shock of what happened, was how did it happen, who planned it? And there were really 2 people who were believed to be the masterminds. One was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was arrested 2 years later in Pakistan, and Osama bin Laden, who would be hunted for about another decade. They headed Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, and that's where the U.S. would go in its attempt to exact revenge. We know today, right, that the World Trade Center site was rebuilt, the Freedom Tower is there. Its spire goes up to 1,776 square feet, marking, right, our date of our founding. But that's the replacement building that's there now. Again, during the shock of it, especially people in New York, right, just didn't know where people were. They didn't know who was lost or missing, who was just out of touch for a while. And you had these very surreal images of people, right, digging through the rubble, people trying to find loved ones. There became, of course, the need for surveillance and intelligence, and the phrase that we hear today, if you see something, say something. So George Bush, in his address to Congress, he announces a global war on terror. What will that mean? What will that entail? We'll see. But he's going to first bring up the notion of preemptive war. It's too late to stop the war in Afghanistan, but he's going to hint at maybe we should go to war in other places to strike them before they can strike us. He will have an axis of evil that includes Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but also North Korea and the nation of Iran. So the U.S., once we learned that Al-Qaeda was behind it and that they're headquartered in Afghanistan, we of course invade. Less than a month later, not just the United States, but other NATO allies attacked Afghanistan. The Taliban, who was the government and had given safe harbors to Al-Qaeda, the group, was overthrown in just a couple months. and reconstruction of Afghanistan began. However, the war was still going on. Afghanistan was a very unique place where American and our Afghan allies had control of Kabul, of the capital, but these remote areas, a lot of them were mountainous, were really out of our control. And they were often headed by local militia, local warlords. Some were friendly to the government, some were friendly to Al Qaeda. Some were just friendly to whoever could benefit them the most. So the U.S. would spend 20 years in Afghanistan, our longest war that we've ever fought. Bin Laden was killed in a raid 10 years later. And 3 years after that, while Obama was still president, he announced plans to withdraw. That withdrawal concluded during Biden's presidency in 2021. Then we talked about preemptive war. Another war that occurred was in Iraq. We learned that in 1990 there was the first Persian Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm. But when Saddam Hussein was removed from Kuwait at that time, he was allowed to remain in power in Iraq. And so he spent about 10 years licking his wounds, building up his military, and being, a pretty terrible dictator to his own people. So George Bush decided to invade. He got Congress to go along with it, citing weapons of mass destruction, that Iraq had these chemical weapons that they were stockpiling, that they would eventually use in a war with maybe the United States, maybe its neighbors, maybe Israel. And so that was really the excuse that the U.S. had to declare war on Iraq. There was a relatively quick victory where the government quickly folded. It was fast, kind of like the Persian Gulf War. No weapons of mass destruction were found, however. So a lot of people began to question, was there really a reason to go to war in Iraq, or was this just the U.S. going to war to go to war? Another issue with any war, wars are easy to get into, but they're hard to get out of. What do you do? How do you end the war? How do you have a stable government in the place that you just defeated? And that really becomes the question that will lead to insurgencies throughout Iraq for decades. We install a friendly government, but they can't control everybody in the country. Several people in Iraq were hostile to Americans, but also to the Iraqi government that they saw as in cahoots with the United States. So that war, again, would last years and take the lives of many servicemen and women who were stationed there after the actual war itself ended. Saddam Hussein, the people celebrated his removal. Statues of him were toppled nationwide, and he eventually himself was captured. He had taken off hiding, but he was found basically living in a hole that was dug under basically this small shed in the outskirts of Iraq. So Saddam Hussein was put on trial by the Iraqi people and hanged for his crimes against the Iraqi people. A lot of people, however, questioned the reason why the United States went to war. Was it to find these weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist? Was it for the second George Bush to get back at the dictator that his father, the first George Bush, couldn't? Or was it really to get our hands on oil, as we see in this political cartoon? Or was it to stabilize a region, There's many reasons to go to war, and there are, of course, many conflicting views on wars. Unfortunately, images came of torture at Abu Ghraib, a prison, and Guantanamo Bay, where captives were interrogated using what they called at the time enhanced interrogation techniques, but a lot of people called them cruelty, human rights violations. And as images of those came out, the United States image suffered worldwide. The U.S., of course, says, that they need this intelligence to get to the truth of the matter. So after September 11th, we have a few big things going on. Safety and security was a paramount concern. You can, if you're talking to people who are alive for September 11th, you can also ask them what they remember about going to the airports. You only went through a metal detector to get to your plane before September 11th, but of course security and scanning is much more stringent today. The Patriot Act was passed, which allowed for surveillance of people that were believed to be domestic terrorists. The government could get warrants to tap people's phones, but how they got those and whether those warrants were truly needed or not was, of course, an issue. So there's always this tension between privacy and security, and where do we fall on that line? How much of one thing are we willing to give up to have the other? There's no easy question, and those questions remain today. The economy under George Bush did okay. That early recession got better. It's called a jobless recovery. It was good for some people, and it was so-so for other people who didn't get ahead so much. The economy itself, though, would falter toward the end of his second term. Before we get there, George Bush ran for re-election, and he won by a more comfortable margin in 2004, as we can see here. A big disaster that happened during Bush's second term was Hurricane Katrina. So this is August of 2005. Hurricane Katrina was, I believe, the third most powerful hurricane to strike the U.S., but where it hit made it so much more deadly than anything else. So 1,800 people were killed in not just Louisiana, New Orleans, but also Mississippi, Alabama, along the Gulf Coast. This would be the most expensive and destructive storm in American history. 80% of New Orleans itself was flooded. If you look at the image on the bottom right, those darker areas, that's water, that's sewage, that's stuff that's flooded those lower lying parts of New Orleans. And the government was supposed to respond. The Federal Emergency Management Association, FEMA, comes in to respond during these times of emergency, but FEMA faced a lot of criticism for not being prepared and really not being able to handle what was needed. Why New Orleans flooded? If you've ever been there, it's a very unique city. You know that Lake Pontchartrain is on one side and the Mississippi River is on the other side, but New Orleans itself is a bowl-shaped city, and almost all of it is below sea level. There are levees and flood walls that protect the city from high water, but they can't protect it when there was a storm surge as terrible as Hurricane Katrina. The levees failed, those man-made dams basically broke, and water flooded into the city, causing a humanitarian nightmare. So the big thing that happened as George Bush's second term was winding down was that the economy seemed to be doing well, but there were a lot of warning signs. And very quickly, as right about the summer of 2008, just a few months before the next election, everything changed dramatically for the worst. You can see in here the retail sales and industrial production plummeted. You can see unemployment went from about 4% to 10% in just the matter of a few months. People were not confident in the economy, and the building of new homes and new home sales stopped dramatically. One of the main reasons for this was, it was called the subprime crisis. And basically what went on was banks were so anxious to sell more mortgages, right, more home loans to people, that they were giving home loans to people that probably shouldn't have qualified for home loans, or they were allowing people to qualify for an amount that was way above what their income could support. And what happens is, if you can't pay your mortgage, right, your home loan, you get evicted. Not only that, but the bank is going to lose some of its money too. If that happens just here or there to one or two homes, banks can weather that storm. But in this case, they couldn't, with so many people losing their homes and defaulting on their mortgages, and the economy just tanked. Now, like we said, this is going on right as the election is about to happen. Perhaps thankfully for George Bush, his term was up. He wouldn't have to deal with it. It would fall to the people who were running in 2008. And we can see from the top right that the candidates were Barack Obama, the Democratic candidate, and John McCain, a Republican senator from Arizona who was a war hero from Vietnam. Obama himself was a fairly new senator from Illinois. So key issues that came up were the continuation of the war in Iraq. It had started 5 years before, but we were still there. It was still going on. And then, of course, that economic crisis. And more than anything in a presidential election, the economy is probably what's going to decide who wins or if someone gets reelected or not. Now, Bush was gone, right? But McCain was a Republican like Bush. And a lot of people felt that McCain's plans, the things he was suggesting, weren't really going to handle the crisis at hand. This was the second worst economic disaster in American history. The only thing worse was the Great Depression. So that tells you just how terrible of an issue it was. Obama is elected, like we said, by a fairly comfortable margin, as you can see. And he'll have a few things that he's going to work on. So how do you deal with this economic crisis? That's one thing. Let's talk about that first. A lot of these banks were on the verge of failing. And many people said, well, you know what? Those banks made bad loans. Let's let them fail. The problem is, if a bunch of banks fail all at once, people were worried that that would make the economic catastrophe worse. So what happens? The government bails out these banks. The government loans money to banks. It's usually banks loaning money to people, right? But the government bailed out these banks. They kept them afloat. Some of them went bankrupt and were absorbed by other banks, but others, the government said, you know what, we're going to loan you this money. You do have to pay us back with interest. That created a lot of controversy because a lot of people were like, hey, you know what, these banks created this problem. Let's just let them fail. Obama and his advisors thought, you know what, if that were to happen, we could seriously go into something like the Great Depression all over again. So it remained controversial. Same thing happened with airlines and auto companies. People did not have the money to spend, and so the government bailed out auto companies who did pay the government back. Same thing with airlines. Domestically, other issues were Obamacare. We'll talk about that in just a second. And something we still hear about today are the Dreamers and DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This deals with immigration and children who were brought to the United States when they were kids before they really could have any say into what was going on. Foreign policy. Obama tries to draw down our commitment to Iraq and Afghanistan. Like we said, bin Laden was killed, and Obama will support, there were some uprisings in the Middle East called the Arab Spring, in which places like Libya and Egypt overthrew more dictatorial leaders in favor of something that was closer to democracy. Okay, so what was Obamacare? We hear about it today. It's in the news today, literally right now as we're living our lives. But the idea behind Obamacare was government insurance for everybody. This had gone all the way back to Harry Truman after World War II, to Truman's Fair Deal. So we're talking from like 1945 that presidents had worked on it. Johnson had Medicare and Medicaid, extended insurance for some people, but not everybody. So what Obamacare did was said that the government would give money to people in the form of tax credits to go buy insurance on their own. It wasn't government insurance, it was money from the government via tax credits to go enroll in health care. There were a lot of other, it wasn't just the health care ability to have it, but as you can see, preventative care became free. So your yearly checkup at your doctor no longer cost $100 or your $40 copay, but that preventative care was free. State by state, there were exchanges where people could go on and shop. Young adults under age 26 were able to stay on their parents' insurance until that age. A lot of times what happened before that was you could be on your parents' insurance until you graduated college and then you were off on your own. But there were a lot of people, right? Maybe they didn't make enough to have their own insurance straight out of college. So it allowed people to stay on. Pre-existing conditions would have to be covered by insurance companies. If you had a pre-existing condition before Obamacare, if you had cancer, if you had some disease that's expensive for insurance to treat, when your insurance changed, most people got it through their workplace, but maybe your workplace changed from United Healthcare to Blue Cross Blue Shield. Well, when they had that change, that new insurance company used to be able to deny you coverage. They would say, we're not going to cover you because you have a pre-existing condition. Basically, they don't want to be on the hook for an expense that something that you had before you even signed with the insurance. Obamacare said that's not fair. If you have cancer, that's expensive, and whether your insurance changes or not, that has to be covered. So those are just some of the things that came out of Obamacare. It really transformed American healthcare. However, like we said, it's still in the news today. Some people like it, some people don't. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was that stimulus to get the economy going, like we said. It wasn't only bailouts for those companies, but it infused money, government money, to do things to put people to work. So I remember in San Antonio, there were projects, road projects, construction projects that were funded by the government. This is kind of an echo of the New Deal, where people were put to work. There were highways that were expanded, right? And the hope was that those construction companies, right, the states would get this money from the government. They would decide to have road construction or beautification projects, and they would go spend this money, right, by having these companies create those improvements. That, of course, would then trickle down into the economy as those workers, the construction workers, the people who are doing the work, right, who are buying the supplies from other companies. As that money goes to those people, it is spent in the economy and gets the economy going. So that begs this question, right? Is it okay for the federal government to use taxpayer money to try and get the economy going again? Most economists would say in a severe downturn, yes, it is. Because if you don't do anything, you have this downward spiral. That's how the Great Depression started. The question is, when do you do that? When is an emergency serious enough to do that, and when is it not? Do you bail out companies? If so, when, right? These are questions that people still debate today. And as we talk about today, here we are, right? We're ending with Obama, 2008. That's kind of usually with history, we say about 20 years or so of history. But think about today, right? Think about these issues. Everything we've seen this semester. What have we studied? History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Those things come back around again, right? I mentioned echoes earlier. We see reminders. Maybe we have deja vu moments. What are those things that happened in the past that still reverberate today? More importantly, what can we learn from the past to bring to the present to better impact our future? I want to thank you for watching, not just today, but this semester. It's been a great semester. I appreciate everything you've done. I've enjoyed this tremendously. I'd like to thank y'all one more time. I'd like to thank the people on the title slide for their resources that went into this presentation, coworkers for their input, and all rights are reserved. This was made by me. Thank you for watching. Thank you for an amazing semester. Take care of each other. Bye-bye.